How do we learn? Metacognition and cognition. As you work through the material in this section, try to keep in mind your own assumptions about how you learn. Consider what strategies have always worked best for you, and think about things that have made learning challenging for you, or things in your life that have always seemed harder to learn than others. Finally, reflect briefly on what you know about learning. It is not only based on your own experience, but also on the experience of others, and it is important to learn about learning. We're all learning at the same time, but here's the thing, a lot of how students work and how our brains work ends up being pretty counterintuitive. And a lot of the ways we have been taught to think about learning actually go against the ways our brains are wired to learn. Or what do I mean? Anyone listening to this has at some point heard, "You're a math person." Or been told, "You're not a math person." Most of us have probably achieved one or the other. But the truth is, there is no such thing as a math person. However, believing that we are, or are not, a math person changes the way we learn math. As another example, who has been told that practice makes perfect? I remember being 30 an hour on my multiplication tables when I was a kid, writing down simple problems over and over again, hoping that if I wrote them down enough times, they would stick in my brain. But it turns out that this idea of letting it click is one of the least productive strategies we have for long-term learning. Memorization as an ineffective strategy. So what are productive strategies? When we understand our brains, we will be able to design learning strategies in the classroom and in life that can maximize our ability to learn efficiently and deeply. How does it work or learn? What happens in our brains when we learn something new? How do we go from zero understanding to being able to use a concept or skill in our daily lives? I'm going to introduce you to a 3-step process by which learning occurs. This isn't a complete picture, but it gives you a general idea and provides a framework that we can use to build strategies on how to make our brains work better for us in the classroom. When it comes to learning something new, the process that happens in our brains is very similar to the process of building a library. Let's say I'm building my library. First, private library, and someone gives me a book on car repair. The first step I'm going to take is to figure out what I'm holding, look at the back cover, read the index, flip through the chapters to see what the book is about. This step of reading the book for the first time is called encoding. Encoding means forming an impression of something, taking sensory information and forming a representation, or what's called a memory trace in the brain. This happens in our short-term memory, and it happens all the time. Every new experience we have, every new impression made on us creates a new memory trace. And because we form memory traces all the time, not all memory traces are preserved. Not everything makes it from short-term to long-term memory. Think about my library. Anyone who's ever collected anything knows that when people know something, machine translated by Google, that you are collecting, they start giving you things all the time. And as a collector, it's your job to decide what to keep and what to give away. Once my friends and family know I'm building my library, they'll start giving me books by the handful and the right, and I'll have to figure out what's useful and what might give back. The way to do that is to figure out how each new book or memory trail helps me in my day-to-day life and how it fits in with what's already in my library. As someone who drives cars, knowing how to do things like check tire pressure or change the oil would be helpful, so having a book on how to do those things in my library will be helpful. And to make it as useful as possible, I'll want to put it somewhere that makes sense, where I can easily find it in the future, if and when I need it. This step of figuring out where this book belongs in my library is called consolidation. Consolidation reorganizes and stabilizes memory traces, meaning, and connections to past experiences and other knowledge in long-term memory. In other words, consolidation takes the new information we receive and connects it with other ideas we already have with what we already know based on our previous knowledge. For the library, it means sticking the book I decided to keep in the mechanic's office and recognizing that it probably belongs there, along with the medium's old driving manual. And perhaps next to the map book I have ready for my next car trip. It also means setting aside the book that is not, say, in the cookbook collection or 2 art and photography books. If the first step was to read the book, the second step is to get the book and find a good home. The third step, then, is to find the book later, using my library. Let's say we matched a man and a car that don't stick together. If all you had was a huge building full of books stacked haphazardly, it would be impossible to find that auto repair manual when you needed it. Just like taking the time to organize your library, it's important to know that you don't need to know when it's time to organize your library. In the morning, my car won't start. The last step in the learning process. This is what's called retrieving, searching, and using memories. It turns out that the more regularly we retrieve information, the more regularly we cycle through books in our libraries, the faster we'll be able to find information in the future and the deeper we'll be able to find ourselves. When you think about it, it makes sense. The more you visit each section of the library, the better you'll be able to know what books are on the shelf. Likewise, the more regularly we recall and use the information we learn, the better we will be able to find and apply it in the future. Thus, the basic process of learning, encoding or absorbing new information, consolidating or organizing it and making connections with what we already know, and retrieving or using the information in practice. Understanding how this process works can give us some practical steps as we learn more deeply and allow us to choose strategies that work with our brains and what our brains are already wired to do. Activation of prior knowledge. Every new piece of information we learn builds on a foundation of prior knowledge. We learn new ideas by connecting them to what we already know, by adding them to an existing network of concepts and relationships. The more we know about a topic or idea, the more easily we can learn it. Because the more we have to reconnect. Let me give you an example. My nephew Sean has been trying to learn colors for months. He will line up his Matchbox cars in a row, and my sister will point to one end. Say, Sean, what color is that? Machine translated by Google. For a long time, the answer was always yellow. Not because all his cars are yellow, but because he knew that yellow was a word people usually say after the color. And that if he said yellow and stepped to be right, everyone would applaud and tell him how clever he was, and it would be exciting. I had a kind of connection, but I didn't have the full picture. Recently, though, Sean figured out what yellow meant. He learned his first color and suddenly the rest of the colors were easy. Once you have the abstract idea of what a color is, you have context, and each new color is just an example of an idea you already understand. Learning new colors is simply a process of naming what you see and perceive. Of course, most of what we learn in college and in the world is much more complex than a baby learning colors. But the same basic principle remains. It's easier to assimilate and retain new information when we have a framework, a context to fit it into. How does this help us in the classroom? If we know that prior knowledge is important for learning, then one of the best tools at our disposal in any new learning project is to self-assess our prior knowledge. Before we begin, we want to start by asking ourselves 2 essential questions. What are we trying to learn, and what do we already know? Asking these questions early on helps us confirm that we're ready to go, that our prior knowledge is adequate. Let's say I want to learn multivariate calculus, but all I know about math so far is algebra. Self-assessing what I know so far helps me recognize that I'm missing algebra 2, geometry, trigonometry, pre-calculus, single variable calculus. It helps me recognize that I Can probably learn multivariate calculus, but it will take extra work and time to fill in the gaps, and it may end up being more time than I'm able to put in. Assessing what I already know helps me recognize that maybe I'm not ready for that deep learning project. And then you might want to take a few steps back. For yourself in the classroom, you might ask yourself questions like, what do I already know about this topic or field? And have I learned a similar subject or skill? What will my teacher expect from me? No. When I show up to class on the first day in terms of facts and background, but also in terms of skills and techniques that are used in the field? Machine translated by Google. The other reason why assessing prior knowledge is useful is simply because it forces us to recall what we already know. And it reminds us of the connections and partnerships that are already available to us. Consciously taking the time to take inventory of what we know is related to priming our brains to make connections as we absorb that information. And it helps us distinguish what is new and important from what is already familiar throughout the lecture and readings, right? It helps us know when the teacher is very up to date and we didn't know it yet, since teachers remind us of something we learned a long time ago. It also prepares us to think of learning as a process of making connections. The same strategy of consciously working to identify new information and how it fits into what we already know is there not just at the beginning of a project, but at every step. Along the way. Self-assessment is not a one-time thing, it is an ongoing foundation that we are working on as we learn. As we move forward, we can ask ourselves questions like, how does this topic relate to other topics I have learned in the past? How does each new topic or unit connect to those that came before and after? What stories are being told by this information? The effect of this periodic self-assessment in this effort to connect new ideas to prior knowledge is to foster what is called conceptual learning. If we learn by connecting information to what we already know, the more connections we can make, the better we will be able to retain that information. By asking ourselves questions about how ideas connect, we force ourselves to think consciously about these conceptual connections, to tell each other stories, to draw maps of how ideas fit together. If we take the time to ask these questions, we can use our understanding of the importance of prior knowledge to set ourselves reasonable learning challenges and help our brains along the way to make the connections we know are essential for deep learning. The importance of effort. Many of the strategies we gravitate toward as learners are strategies that help make learning easy, and in many ways, this makes sense. It's intuitive to look for the moments when something starts to feel easy and use them as evidence that we've achieved mastery. But here's the thing. While this intuition is correct in the long run, in the short term, learning should actually feel challenging. It takes effort. And it turns out that, to some extent, the more effort we put into our learning, or in other words, the harder we have to work at it, the more effective it will be in the long run. The metaphor I often use with my students is going to the gym. If you signed up for a gym, if you went to the gym and went to work out with an instructor, and at the end of the session, you weren't tired, and the next morning, you weren't sore at all, you'd probably be pretty dissatisfied, right? I know. You would. Feeling sore the next morning is part of how you know you've had a good workout. It helps you know when you need to push harder. These weights feel easy, better to scale, or when I need to back off. That feedback, that soreness, helps you walk the line between wow, that was an amazing workout, and I literally can't get up right now, maybe. I may have exaggerated. When we think about learning strategies, the same principle applies. Instead of looking for natural talents in places where learning seems easy, we should instead look for ways to feel the burn, so to speak. We should set learning goals that are challenging, and in our specific study practices, we should be looking to introduce that extra element of difficulty, those few extra pounds at the end of the dumbbell, to make sure we're getting our money's worth for the time we're putting in. How? One really important strategy for strenuous learning is what's called priming your mind. In practice, this means trying to solve a problem before you learn the answer. The goal isn't to come up with a solution right away. Instead, it's to try to figure out what you don't know and what you'll need to know to solve the problem so that you can treat your readings and lectures like a scavenger hunt, looking for the pieces you need. Metacognitively, this works by helping to increase the brain's recognition of the practical application of new information. If you know why information is important, you're more likely to make connections and stick with them. Putting in the extra effort to try to understand a problem we're not ready to solve helps us build context and a need that learning can help us fill. A second strategy is what's called spaced retrieval practice. Spaced retrieval practice works on the idea that forgetting is a very important part of remembering. Instead of sitting down and poring over a problem for hours on end, which you do until you can do it in your sleep study mode, it involves breaking up your practice sessions into several shorter sessions with plenty of time in between. This works by allowing a concept to move from your short-term memory back into your long-term storage, so that every time you sit down to study, you're practicing retrieving the information as well as applying it. Put another way, by giving your brain time to forget, you give yourself another chance to practice remembering, and each time we remember, it comes a little faster and is a little better than the last time. Another strategy is what's called entanglement, going back and forth between different types of problems and applications of a new concept. This helps us apply spaced recovery practice on a faster schedule, but it also helps us do things a little harder. Moving back and forth between different tasks forces us to try a little harder to refocus and refocus. This effort, while it may seem harder in the moment, produces better learning in the future. Think about the gym. You don't do the same exercises every time you go. You alternate, intersperse, to make sure your muscles don't adapt to the single task assigned to them and plateau. Interleaving problem types does the same thing for our learning that interleaving exercises does for our bodies, increasing the level of difficulty so that instead of our brains adapting to perform a specific task or concept in one application, they have to keep working to identify what task or concept is at stake and learn to apply it in many different contexts. This takes away familiarity and, in doing so, prevents us from falling into the studio on autopilot. Machine translated by Google. What these strategies have in common is that they take the unconscious processes that are already happening in our brains and add conscious effort. When it feels easy, it's often because we're working on autopilot, and it's hard to tell how much we're actually learning and gaining from a task, whether or not the gym membership is worth it. On the other hand, when we choose strategies that require conscious and intentional effort, we create a feedback loop where we can feel the work we're doing and know if it's working. Much like our sore muscles the day after a tough gym session. To help us assess whether or not we've had a good workout, practicing hard study gives us a way to assess how we're doing when we stop studying on autopilot and helps us feel the burn. Self-assessment, a 3-step process for learning. Learning is a 3-step process. Remember the description of each step of the process. Codification. The brain converts your perceptions into chemical and electrical changes that form a mental representation, memory trace, of the patterns you have observed. 72. Consolidation. The brain recognizes and stabilizes memory traces. This can occur over several hours or more and involves deep processing of new material. During which scientists believe the brain replays or rehearses learning, giving it meaning, filling in blanks, and making connections with past experiences and other knowledge already stored in long-term memory. 73. Recovery. The brain updates learning and allows us to apply it when we need it most. 100. For this to happen most efficiently, we must associate the material with a diverse set of cues that will make us adept at recalling the knowledge later. The task of deep learning is more than memorizing knowledge. 75. Mentality. Every semester I teach a class to new students about growth mindset, and I start with a question. Who here is a math person? Usually about half the class raises their hand. Then I ask, who is not a math person? The other half raises their hand. And then I'll tell you the trick, everyone who raised their hand is wrong. There is no such thing as a math person. But our beliefs about whether or not we are a math person change the way we learn math. The idea of a math person is an example of a mindset. In general, a mindset is a set of ideas or attitudes that we have about something, especially when those ideas are considered difficult to change. It's a personal ideology, a set of assumptions that we use to filter the world around us. Machine translated by Google. When it comes to learning, there are two broad categories of mindsets. The first is what's called a fixed mindset. This is the idea that intelligence is something, we have a certain amount of it, we can't change whether we are or aren't mathematicians. And that's it. The second category is what's called a growth mindset, or the recognition that intelligence can grow and develop in response to effort and good strategies. A growth mindset is an acknowledgement that anyone can learn math and that the harder we work, the better we will become. The reason mindset is important is that what we believe directly influences our behavior, and by influencing our behavior, it influences our learning outcomes. Let's say you think you're a math person and that math is a challenge that you'll be able to scale. When you sit down in class to give a lecture or sit down with your textbook to do your homework, you are working under the assumption that the math will make sense and that you will be able to learn the material. When it gets tough or something doesn't make sense, your response will be to ask a question or ask for help, and you will probably keep trying and trying new strategies until the idea starts to make sense. On the other hand, if you think that you are not a math person, then whenever the material gets challenging, the first thing you think is probably something like, what's the point of this? I'm not going to be able to learn this anyway. I know I've had these thoughts, especially when I'm looking at a really difficult test in front of me. A fixed mindset assumes that there will be a limit to your abilities, a ceiling to what you can learn, and so when you approach learning with a fixed mindset, you interpret negative feedback as evidence that you have met and hit your ceiling, and you unconsciously give yourself permission to stop trying. Now, let me be clear, mindset is not magical thinking. It's not believing and therefore success is not going to happen without effort. What is working from the assumption that you will be able to succeed so that if something doesn't work and if you don't find success, instead of saying, this is my ceiling, you focus on more useful questions like, why isn't this working? And what could you be doing differently? Because there's always something you could be doing differently. Maybe the problem is that you don't have enough prior knowledge and need to take a few steps back. Maybe it's because the study strategy you're using isn't the most effective for the material, or that you're not putting in enough hours in practice to achieve mastery. Whatever the challenge, a growth mindset seeks to identify and then address the challenge, asking for help and leveraging resources along the way. I'm not a cognitive psychologist, so I won't get into the science here, but you should know that the ideas behind the growth mindset are how it actually works. It works. Our brains learn, change, and adapt in response to our efforts. Most importantly, this process of our brains learning, changing, and adapting, which is known as neuroplasticity, takes work. It doesn't always seem easy, and most of the time, it's not meant to be. Feeling that it is challenging to learn something new is not a sign that we will not be able to learn. In fact, to some extent, it's a sign that we're learning, that we're trying to change our brains. Machine translated by Google. My favorite part about teaching this is that for the vast majority of my students, this is not new information. I work with non-traditional students, students who come from community colleges, military, the workforce, students with families, and students who live outside of college. My students are not afraid of hard work. And they are not afraid of a challenge. Speaking of growth mindset, we have to recognize that struggle is part of success and that anything worth working for is just a reminder that what we already know to be true in life also applies in education. What we know is that there is value in hard work, that there is always more than one way to achieve your goal, that success can mean different things at different times, and that when faced with a challenge, the important thing is not to succeed. Cultivate a growth mindset. Understanding that we should strive to have a growth mindset is easy. Cultivating a growth mindset in practice is not. Watch this 10-minute TED Talk by Carol Dweck, who literally wrote the book on growth mindset, about the ways we can cultivate a growth mindset in our society. Reflection questions. What do these ideas mean to you? What are one or two strategies you could implement to avoid falling into a fixed mindset when faced with a new challenge? The power of the still. I heard about a high school in Chicago where students had to pass a certain number of courses in order to graduate, and if they failed a course, they got a grade of not yet. And I thought that was fantastic, because if you get a failing grade, you think, I'm nothing, I'm nowhere. But if you get a grade of not yet, you realize that you're on a learning curve. It gives you a path for the future. Not yet also gave me insight into a critical event early in my career, a real turning point. I wanted to see how kids dealt with challenges and difficulties, so I gave 10-year-olds problems that were a little too difficult for them. Some of them reacted surprisingly positively. They said things like, I love a challenge, or, I was hoping this would be informative. They understood that their abilities could be developed. They had what I call all a growth mindset. But other students thought it was tragic, catastrophic. From their more fixed perspective, their intelligence had been judged, and they had failed. Instead of reveling in the power of now, they became trapped in the tyranny of now. So, what do they do next? I'll tell you what they do next. In one study, they told us that they would probably cheat next time, instead of studying harder if they failed a test. In another study, after a failure, they sought out someone who did worse than they did so they could feel really good about themselves. And in study after study, they ran away from difficulties. Scientists measured the electrical activity of the brains as the students faced a mistake. Machine translated by Google. On the left, you have students with a fixed mindset. There's almost no activity. They run away from mistakes. They don't engage with them. But on the right, you have students with a growth mindset, the idea that skills can be developed. They're deeply engaged. Their brains are still on fire. They're deeply engaged. They process mistakes. They learn from them and they correct them. How are we raising our children? Are we raising them for now instead of yet? Are we raising kids who are obsessed with getting A's? Are we raising kids who don't know how to dream big dreams? Is their ultimate goal to get the next A or the next test score? And do they carry this need for constant validation with them in their future lives? Maybe because employers come to me and say, we've already raised a generation of young workers who can't get through the day without a reward. So what can we do? How can we build this bridge so far? Here are some things we can do. First, we can praise wisely, not by praising intelligence or talent. That has failed. Don't do that anymore. But by praising the process that kids are engaged in, their effort, their strategies, their focus, their perseverance, their improvement. Praising the process creates strong, resilient kids. There are other ways to reward, too. We recently teamed up with game scientists at the University of Washington to create a new online math game that is still rewarding. In this game, students' effort, strategy, and progress were rewarded. The usual math game rewards you for getting the answers right now, but this process game rewards you And we have more effort, more strategies, more commitment over longer periods of time, and more perseverance when we're faced with really, really tough problems. Just the words yet or not yet, we're finding, give kids more confidence, give them a path to the future that creates more persistence. And we can really change the mindset of students. In one study, we taught them that every time they step outside their comfort zone to learn something new and difficult, the neurons in their brains can form new and stronger connections, and over time, they can become smarter. Here's what happened in this study: the students who didn't receive this growth mindset continued to show declining grades during this difficult school transition, but the ones who received this lesson showed a dramatic increase in their grades. We've now shown this kind of improvement with thousands and thousands of kids, especially struggling students. So let's talk about equality. In our country, there are groups of students who are chronically underachieving, for example, kids in inner cities or kids on Indian reservations. And YVE done so poorly for so long that many people think it's inevitable. But when educators create classrooms with a growth mindset still embedded, equity happens. And here are just a few examples. One year, a kindergarten class in Harlem, New York, scored in the 95th percentile on the National Achievement Test. Many of these kids couldn't hold a pencil when they got to school. In 1 year, 4th graders in the far-behind South Bronx became the number 1 4th grade class in New York State on the state math test. Machine translated by Google. In the space of a year to a year and a half, Native American students at a school on a reservation went from the bottom of their district to the top. Metacognition in practice. 3 things I know to be true about learning. First, learning is a process that should take time and effort. It's not supposed to feel easy, and we should seek out strategies that are about trying to learn new ideas. Second, we learn by making connections to what we already know. Regular self-assessment, and where we are in the learning process, and how new material connects to what we've learned in the past, makes all the difference in our ability to learn deeply and effectively. Third, our mindset about learning new material impacts our results. When we look for roofs, we hit them. When we focus on incremental improvements, we keep moving forward. Each of these ideas can be broken down into specific strategies and takeaways. Concrete action. Items that we need to add to our to-do lists as learners together prepare us to approach learning not just as a cognitive process, but as a metacognitive process. Not just thinking, but thinking about how we think. Not just to learn, but to try to understand how we learn. And how we can learn more effectively. Why? Because, as one of my colleagues likes to say, we are not studio robots. Every person who enters the classroom brings a life experience that shapes whether and how they will participate. Our beliefs about whether we belong in the classroom, whether our abilities will grow with effort, whether we can ultimately succeed, and whether the work we are doing is valuable to us. They directly impact how well we do this because they change the way we approach the material and shape whether we give our brains the chance to go through these cognitive processes that they need to learn. Understanding that learning is a process that takes time and effort helps us reframe the questions we ask when approaching new, challenging material. I move away from the very natural question we are taught as children about what can do this, and focus on the more useful questions of what does it take to do this and what does success mean to me in this context? Understanding that we learn by making connections helps us understand the importance of self-assessment in learning, thinking not only about where we want to go, but also, and sometimes more, about where we started and what our trajectory looks like. Last but not least, understanding how our mindset prepares us to react in certain ways to certain types of feedback helps us anticipate and explain those reactions. Because when we succeed, we focus not on the fact of success, but on the work we do. And when we struggle, then we focus not on failure, but on what to do next and where to turn for help. Self-assessment is important to test our understanding. But it's not just assessing what we know and what we've learned. That's useful. Ask ourselves questions regularly about how we're learning, how we're feeling, and how we can work on it. Our very human reactions in a learning process set us up for the best possible chance of success. We are humans, with human brains, and the better we understand our brains and how they work, the more we will be able to achieve.